Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, movies have quite the challenge in setting the scene and getting the desired reaction because, as I've talked about before, horror, comedy, scares and thrills are all subjective, and what scares you might not scare me, and vice versa. However, despite all the subjectivity involved in these things, basic tenets are assumed for things like unease and tension, and those things usually involve prickling the senses with music, striking images, darkened tones, and emphasised sounds for atmosphere, as well as putting your protagonists in situations which are both threatening and ominous. And when it comes to catharsis, that's a release and reset required from the build-up of the aforementioned unease and tension. Now, if we don't have defined and likeable characters, we have no tension or unease, because if we don't empathise with or like our characters, then we don't feel sad or worried when they walk into danger. But despite using these basic tenets to wring fear through the viewer, sometimes you have to rely on more simple psychological methods and sociological facets to instill assumptions, unease, and a sense of rising dread in the viewer. You see, as a watcher of movies, you are a bystanding voyeur who is privileged to extra information, and when that information is given at the same time as the protagonist, we are already second guessing and making approximate judgments, because movies are psychologically interactive and they want the viewer to be soaked in the story that we are already expecting, dreading, and jumping to conclusions about what's going to come next. And let's be clear, establishing unease and tension isn't easy, so for today's video, join me as we look at how movies build unease and tension and lets the viewer into little secrets, gets their brains working, and shows them with sometimes neon arrows where the story is going, but also undercuts those neon arrows with simple nuance which subvert expectations. And, as ever, we're going to follow a flow-through chart, and today's topics are not playing to the gallery of stereotypes, opposites and incongruences, screaming at the screen, cathartic payoff. Right then, let's crack on. Now, horror movies and tense thrillers are designed to evoke fear, suspense, keep viewers on the edge of their seats, and generally create a sense of unease and tension. This excitement and anxiety stimulates the brain to produce beta waves at 12 to 30 Hz, which are associated with active thinking and problem solving, and also gamma waves, 30 Hz and above, linked to heightened perception and stress. These higher frequencies keep the brain alert and vigilant and ready to react to any perceived threats. Our brains light up everywhere when watching movies, but a good thriller or horror should be hitting the limbic system, which is all about our lizard brain and its fight or flight response and emotivity. Scientists have even coined a term called neurocinematics, which talks about the effects movies have on four major areas of our brain, which are called hippocampus, memory processing, learning and emotions; hypothalamus, area of hormone production, body temperature and appetite; amygdala, emotional processing, activation of fight or flight response; and thalamus, processes sight, hearing, taste and touch. Now, neurocinematics is a far too broad term and study to encompass in one video essay, so we're going to look today at how tension, unease and then catharsis helps the brain empathise, study and then release and reset through the conclusion of the movie. And we're going to stick to 3 films here, so spoilers abound for the first Wolf Creek, the movie Breakdown, and the recent James McAvoy remake of Speak No Evil. Okay, so firstly, we come to not playing to the gallery of stereotypes. It's important that our antagonists, environments, and scenarios are not cartoonish parodies or the subject of ridicule. Now, it's important when talking about playing to the gallery of stereotypes to define that we are not talking about the individual viewer's personal prejudice. Instead, what I mean is that we all have assumptive appropriations when it comes to a place or specific group of people or, in some case, objects. But the environment is also important, as is the situation, and so we enter a balancing act between using broad strokes to define where we are in the world, but not caricatures which cause the viewer to smirk or see the actor on screen as little more than an avatar of ridicule. So let's look at some examples of playing to the gallery of stereotypes. Now, according to The Simpsons, the British all have bad teeth, and according to Family Guy, we're all posh-talking aristocrats who are terribly polite, eat awful food, and have, well, bad teeth. But that's comedy, and they are using stereotypes and prejudice to conjure excessive caricatures. However, if you watch the original Friday the 13th or the first Wrong Turn movie, some places in America are also caricatured, and that is done by saying they have that yokel weirdo who don't like outsiders, or tells the protagonist there's a curse and they should turn back, only for them to be mocked by the savvy, well, no, stupid inner city kids. Take Wrong Turn, for example, when Desmond Harrington is lost and late and trying to get to an important appointment, and he encounters a local who says, "You cutting wires with me, son?" Now, clearly a fish out of water and someone who isn't from that part of America, we know that Desmond Harrington isn't from that area because his dress code, haircut, and accent doesn't match who he is speaking to. But giving him someone like Cletus from The Simpsons to talk to means that we are losing realism and subtlety for a sledgehammer stereotype. We have been shown in decades, both in movies and in comedy parodies, that, despite it being the United States, there's a lot of acrimony between some southern state traditionalists and the more liberal city folk who bring their drugs and premarital sex to a much more conservative and godly country. However, this vision of what people from southern states are all like isn't the case, and playing to the gallery of stereotypes, the movie sets its tone and triggers prejudicial parts of our brain, such as the amygdala, which is the almond-shaped hub of the limbic system and deals with fight or flight, and causes subconscious negative reactions. And the problem with this is it leads to parody and silly images like all Australians wear cork hats and fight kangaroos, all British people eat horrible food and are pit polite and prudish, or the French all have wine for breakfast and cycle round with berets on. Now, what we want for Rising Dread and Fear are clear visual signifiers, but more subtle yet painfully obvious deviances in presentation which cause our limbic system to pick up on the slight incongruences without the movie playing to this gallery of stereotypes. And when we're not playing to the gallery, we're offering realism, and I've no doubt you've heard that tone whenever there is a new reboot these days, when we're told it's going to be dark and gritty, or it's a new and grounded approach. And that's because the broad strokes of stereotypes are abandoned, and we instead ask the viewer to come and relate and empathise with what's being shown on screen, rather than look at it and almost smirk and mock. Now, take the recent remake of Speak No Evil, which stars James McAvoy of the X-Men prequels and Scoot McNairy from Gareth Edwards' Monsters. Scoot McNairy is a wealthy city man who's having quite a few domestic issues. His work and marriage are both in tatters, and his daughter is growing into a young lady, but she's still acting like a regressed child and panics all the time, needs her soft toy Hoppy, and has periods where she has to be calmed with an app on her phone. When this family first meet McAvoy's mob, McAvoy drags a sun lounger from where they are sunbathing in a very direct and discourteous manner, and then proceeds to dive bomb into the pool in what looks like quite a refined resort. In Breakdown, starring the brilliant Kurt Russell, him and his wife are passing through villages and remote towns, but rather than being met by bumpkins and stereotypes telling them they are cursed or ain't welcome here, boy, the locals simply stop and stare as he passes through and asks questions. One of them does try and start a fight and mocks his very modern truck, but that's more about just male bravado rather than saying he's a yokel. And in the first Wolf Creek movie, the teens are enjoying the rich pastures of sunsets and Australian life, and occasionally rubbing people up the wrong way, but the Antipodeans are not all wearing plaid shirts and throwing shrimps on the barbie like they're in a bad Foster's beer advert. Instead, the world is painted as identifiable, be it European or American or Australian, without assaulting the senses via one-dimensional images or prejudices. And this enables us to get to know our characters, enjoy the spectacle, and settle into the film as voyeurs and appreciate a rounded world and not a comedic one. However, it's important to start to notice that things are going to go wrong because, as the viewer, we are the ones piecing this scenario together and spotting the early warning signs and empathising or cringing with situations which make us either squirm or turn to our partner and make a guess that sets off alarm bells in our head because we all have a sense of danger and self-preservation within our brains. And to start these internal alarm bells ringing, the movie uses something called opposites and incongruences. The antagonist must be of a different ilk to the protagonist, and the viewer needs to see uncomfortable incongruences in the now worsening scenario. And let's bring in some social compliance now, because our reactions are usually mood congruent. That means we cry when we're upset, flirt when aroused, shout when angry, or withdraw when we're frightened. And that's because we are going both with social compliance and the natural non-verbal and verbal cues of what our species does. Basically, our reactions are congruent to how we feel. And horror plays on these well by putting in villains whose presentation doesn't match this mood, and they immediately give off the vibes that something is wrong. And it's not always through a blank mask. Sometimes you'll see characters who act completely the opposite and continue to act no matter how uncomfortable the protagonist feels. Basically, their presentation doesn't match the mood or the situation that's required. And unlike playing to the gallery of stereotypes, we're firmly in the believable and appreciable, and when you're crying in distress while someone laughs, it causes a dissonance in the basic social compliance and expectations of what our species, humans, should do in certain situations. Let's take an example of opposites. In Speak No Evil, Scoot McNairy's family are having problems, but they are presented as decent people who are quite impotent and also reserved in both their non-existent extroversion and very tame manners. McAvoy's family, however, are not, and dance around their hotel room in their underwear, are direct and very obnoxious in the way they speak and chastise their son with severe physical reprimands when he upsets them, and the very nature of how they act causes concern to Scoot McNairy's family as they find this behaviour both odd and uncomfortable, and the viewer, us, as voyeurs, pick up on this discomfort as passive observers. We're also observing our protagonists' non-verbal communication here. We're watching them cringe, blink, look a little bit confused at what's going on, or genuinely uncomfortable when a boy is slapped and they don't like it. In Breakdown, Kurt Russell meets a native at the gas station, and this native is everything that Kurt Russell isn't. The native is bold, aggressive, disapproving of Kurt's nice car and his city boy look. However, as their conversation escalates, the man gets increasingly more argumentative, despite the apology and Kurt's verbal and non-verbal semantics of requesting peace by apologising, dropping everything, and just wanting to move on. Later on, when he meets the police, the officer is dismissive and patronising, and even when he reaches the station and sees all the missing people, the lack of the policeman's concern doesn't fit with the worsening scenario of his missing wife and the self-evident, blatant, objective evidence that this is a frequent occurrence. In Wolf Creek, when discussing life in Australia with Mick Taylor, the awesome John Jarratt, the girls are less than impressed by his graphic description of how he kills pigs, but Mick just keeps on laughing and getting more explicit, despite the non-verbal and visual cues from the protagonist on their faces that they're not comfortable with this and they don't want to talk about it. Then, as the conversation gets more awkward and long silences start happening as Mick toys with them, Mick always cuts short those long silences with his famous grotesque laugh, and the incongruence and awkwardness is suddenly rebalanced as if he's saying, "Just messing with you." We empathise with both happiness and sadness, danger or success, but to activate those parts of our brain, we need identifiable situations which we can place ourselves in and see the incongruences, inconsistencies, and the oddities, and know something is up here. We know something isn't right. Opposites are important because wherever you are and whoever you are and whatever country you are watching this, you have a type of person you like to be around. And what I mean by that is, for me, I'm quite the introvert these days who likes time alone and doing things like reading or listening to podcasts. So I'm not going to be drawn to a loud and crass sports fanatic, although I do love sports, who wants to be in a pub all day and is swearing, shouting and getting into fights. And I'm probably the last person a late night loving socialite would want to hang around with, much because I like cosy nights and a set routine, whereas they like to go out till all hours and just have lots of fun. Sure, I can still go out and let my hair down, but day to day I'm kind of set in my ways, and I like people of a similar ilk. And as opposites create discomfort, cringe and general awkwardness, you tend to steer clear of people who make you feel that way. Let's get back to our movies and take the scene in Speak No Evil where James McAvoy appears to be receiving oral sex under the dinner table. Yes, it's all a crass joke, but he pushes this joke to the point where the guests are feeling genuinely uncomfortable, and based upon the marriage problems that the prim and proper Scoot McNairy and his wife are having, we can feel the physical and mental discomfort as this extrovert behaviour starts to dominate the introvert couple and the tension increases exponentially. And when we are building unease, it's important that our protagonists are at odds with the antagonists or environment as anyone will know, people are strange when you're a stranger, as the old song goes, and it's tough being a fish out of water or trying to reason with someone you have nothing in common with, or who is acting in the opposite way that you are, and it can actually get quite frightening at times. Let's stay with Speak No Evil, where we have posh city types with the timid child and the book-loving parents going to stay with country folk who are loud, sexually aggressive in their displays of public affection, rustic and very labile in their presentation. Even when McAvoy's wife undresses and shows her bruises, she laughs it off and puts it down to being too rough in bed. Their idea of a good time is jumping into a lake with just their underwear on, whereas the city family are more reticent and, when talking about sex, Scoot McNairy is clearly embarrassed that he only gets laid about once a month if he's lucky, whilst McAvoy happily bonks his lover every single day. And McNairy's wife is a vegetarian, and McAvoy takes great pleasure in describing the butchery of the goose and then force-feeding her some meat. All in all, we feel the discomfort and intimidation of this stronger, brasher and more physically open and emotionally regressed family. However, it's important to pick up on a relationship in this film that is congruent, and that is between the two children. The boy can't talk, for various reasons, and the girl is very shy, and they hit it off like a house on fire. And this is why the little boy starts letting the girl into what's going to happen next. He starts to let her into the great secret and risks his own life. And the reason he does that is because, unlike Scoot McNairy's family with James McAvoy's, these two are connecting, they get on, they get each other, and they really like each other. When we bond with people we trust, we open up. When it's opposite and incongruence, we stay reserved, cringy, distant. In the movie Breakdown, Kurt Russell and his wife are city folks, and now they are around more rural and uncouth locals. Kurt's more city unrefined accent is at odds with the deep drawls of the locals, and he's repeatedly terrorised by people who are stronger, more corrupt and dishonest, and even the truck which the man at the gas station drives is more run down and rustic than Kurt's latest model and becomes a source of an argument. Wolf Creek is also about the opposites of age and physicality, as the teams are out-muscled and out of water around Mick, who loves slaughtering animals and virtually lives in his truck, whereas these guys are much more modern. When creating horror and tension, our brains cannot empathise with situations which are extreme or highly unusual. Instead, the viewer needs to be the voyeur to familiarity and identifiable discomfort, which leads us to start Screaming at the screen. Tension is nothing without the viewer clearly seeing the danger and judging the protagonist's foolishness or impossible dilemmas. Now, when I say screaming at the screen, I don't mean you are literally spending the whole movie shouting, "No, get out of there!" What you're doing is thinking one step ahead and castigating the poor judgment of the protagonists or willing the protagonist to just get out. Take Speak No Evil, where we have long realised through incongruence and opposites that, simply by watching McAvoy brutalise his son and intimidate Scoot McNairy's family, we know something is drastically wrong here. Then, when their daughter is found in McAvoy's bed and the family leave but they forget the beloved toy Hoppy, they have to go back because the daughter is so upset because that toy is so important. A child's favourite toy is a life and death matter at times, so Scoot McNairy turns the car around and they go back into the belly of the beast, despite the audience going, "For God's sake, just drive on." Through opposite and incongruence, we know that they are in danger, and we know Scoot McNairy is a weedy little runt who is no match for the physically built and aggressive McAvoy. But even when they try to leave again and McAvoy dumps his son into the water, it's established that the boy cannot swim, we are left with an impossible dilemma of either saving oneself or saving a boy who we can see is drowning. In Breakdown, Kurt Russell has to go against law enforcement and the locals as he discovers a cartel of human trafficking, but be it clinging to the underside of a lorry or walking into the house of his enemy, he has both no choice and is making some very poor decisions, but those are based upon he either saves himself or he goes and saves his wife. But perhaps the best example is at the start when his car breaks down and his wife trundles off with a lorry driver. We know this is a bad idea and they should stay together at all times, and we know that this is the event which will spur the whole film on. We know that really they both should go or none of them should go. And we're screaming at the screen to say, bad idea. In Wolf Creek, we know Mick is the bad guy and going with him is a bad idea, but the issues come when trying to escape him, and each failed escape or attempt at running, sometimes whilst ignoring obvious weapons, has us either second-guessing or face-palming, and when Mick is unconscious and the group has the upper hand, the decision not to further incapacitate, restrain or just kill him is kind of mind-boggling, frustrating, and adds to the sense that these kids are sealing their own fates. We all scream at the screen at various points in movies. Maybe it's when teens say, "Let's split up," or the hero doesn't kill the villain when they have the chance, but it's all about participation, and it's a useful tool to activate our own survival thinking and get us thinking what we would do in that situation. It gets our brains participating in a visual and set medium. We are guessing what we would do. We are ridiculing the characters for doing the opposite. But when stirring emotions in our limbic system, putting us at odds with the scenario and choices creates incredible brain activity and involvement and helps swell the enjoyment and participation in an otherwise visual and aural medium that is pre-filmed and we cannot affect at all. And finally, to make all this tension work, we come to cathartic payoff. All tension is lost if there is no cathartic fight back from the protagonist. So none of this tension building matters a jot if the payoff is rubbish or there is no sense of satisfactory relief from a tension build-up movie. After all, how many horror movies do you know that fall apart in the third act? How many movies engage you and then suddenly cause you to switch off because they just get ridiculous or silly, or sometimes make you feel so sad that you just leave the movie thinking, that was horrible? After all, every good story needs a good ending, and our brains require resolution to fully process what we have seen. And that's because we require catharsis, as we've spent an hour and a half watching our protagonists go through the mill, so we need to partake in the fight back as voyeurs with some vicarious satisfaction of watching their abusers get rinsed, maimed or killed. In Speak No Evil, we discover that James McAvoy's family have accrued their wealth by luring family to their home and slaughtering them, and despite us screaming at the screen for the family to run, the reasons they go back are understandable in terms of their own child's toy and to save the drowning boy. It's also quite primal how the posh and reserved family fight back and, Using everything from their cunning to toxic cleaning chemicals, the retaliation is deserved and cathartic. In Wolf Creek, there is no escape from Mick, and the final scene merely laments how he's still out there and the survivor of the group has now lost his friends. But one still escapes, and we can believe he will go to the police and he will go and do something about his friends dying. Of course, Wolf Creek was actually based upon a real-life killer called Ivan Mallet, and the story is merely a stretched canvas of confabulation and fiction over those real-life murders. However, by managing to escape, there is at least some resolution to the story, and if anyone's seen the brilliant TV series first season starring Lucy Fry, will know that the character at the end of Wolf Creek kind of plays a fairly relevant part in the later episodes of that series. Finally, in Breakdown, we see another reserved man go full beast mode to save his wife, and although struggling with his adrenal retaliation, the tension of this mild-mannered man losing his temper yet going up against unbeatable odds adds both tension, unease and release. And that's because movies actually help our brains deal with emotion, because believe it or not, we can release pent-up and negative emotions about our own lives when we see things on screen, and catharsis acts as a reset for our brains, and that's why tension and unease is so important as we, the third-party viewer, look at the scenario and then get drawn in as if we are there ourselves, identify with the characters, and then feel the release of catharsis. And this has been studied in neurocinematics. Catharsis itself was originally a medical term referring to the flushing out of the body during menstruation, and its definition means to cleanse or purge. Aristotle was the first to use catharsis in its theatrical sense, referring to the emotional discharge a playwright hoped to effect in an audience by the release of pent-up emotion, typically at the end of a good old Greek tragedy, and now movies offer us that too, so we can relate to relatable characters and then feel the pain and empathy of facing insurmountable odds, and after fighting back, we release all that tension and unease and actually partake chemically, in terms of brain activity, in a medium which is purely passive and both visual and aural that we can't affect, but we feel relief from. Tension keeps us hooked, unease builds involvement, and catharsis offers an emotional healing and brain reset by allowing us to cheer for the characters we've been so invested in. Anyway, that's it for this week's video, so remember that psychology is cool. Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, and even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here, or a suggestion for a future video. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
Oh, I can tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.